It comes as no surprise to people when I tell them this. I love Moral Orel. You know that video we made a little while ago about the episode that got Moral Orel cancelled? And how I mentioned that I am so upset that I missed out on the show in its prime? Well, now I'm gonna make up for it. Now I'm gonna start making a lot more Moral Orel videos. I'm hoping to make it a bit of a staple on the channel like The Proud Family or Jimmy Neutron. And in order to do that, we have to plan to make a lot of Moral Orel videos. We've got 4 others in the works right now, and we're not even done yet. But today, we're gonna start them all off, I guess, technically speaking, start them all off unless you don't count the other video, with a character quest. You know, the show where we take a look at underappreciated or underanalyzed characters and tell you what makes them work? Yep, Moral Orel is full of characters that could have these. Characters like Florence, Reverend Putty, Clay and Bloberta, who will actually get theirs in January, or the subject of today's character quest, or rather, subjects, Shapey and Block. Upon hearing this, I'm sure all of you Moral Orel fans out there are saying, "You're kidding me, right? Shapey and Block? What do they have to make them work?" Let me tell you the unfinished coming-of-age story of Shapey Puppington and Block Possible. First of all, we have to start with Shapey Puppington because, given his last name Puppington, he's obviously connected with the main family. So, you know, Clay's the dad, Bloberta's the mom, Orel's the brother, and so now Shapey's the other brother, right? Yeah, well, that's true, but he doesn't quite fit in. Take a look at him next to Clay. Do they look anything alike? The answer is obviously no, because Shapey is, in fact, an illegitimate child. He is actually the product of an affair between Bloberta and Coach Danielle Stopframe. Stopframe only took part in this, though, to get closer to Clay. I don't necessarily know how that works, but oh well, it happened, and now Shapey has been brought into the world, and he is an unadulterated terror. This kid is a monster through and through. Even though he's 7, he barely speaks coherently, he screams in order to get his way, he throws temper tantrums, he gets angry at the drop of a dime. Basically every parent's worst nightmare. But how did he get this way? Well, first of all, Bloberta has been coddling him like crazy. She's still breastfeeding him even though he's 7 years old. So obviously he's being kept young. Not necessarily on purpose, we don't really know why. I kind of think it's just so that Bloberta can have a little bit more control over him because, let's face it, she has no control over anything else. And there's another reason for his behavior. For that, we have to look at Orel Puppington, his older brother. Older half-brother, but still, older brother nonetheless. Judging by before Orel, Orel never really acted like Shapey when he was younger. He was kind, he was sweet, and extremely gullible. Shapey is none of those things, except maybe gullible, but still, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. Well, it's clear that over the years, Clay and Bloberta have really checked out of their marriage. Although, Clay has never really been interested at all, so I'm sure that he was never an attentive parent to Orel, as has been confirmed in Before Orel once again. It's clear that Bloberta at least tried to make things work. All she ever wanted was that happy family and to be useful to someone. That someone would either be her husband or her child. But of course, with Shapey around now and Danielle Stopframe no longer talking to her, she realizes she's stuck in this unhappy, unlovable marriage with Clay, and now Shapey is the constant reminder of that, and so who cares? It's very possible that Shapey was gonna naturally have some behavior issues anyways, but it's clear that she doesn't care enough to make things better. Whenever he begs or complains, she gives him whatever he wants just so that he'll stay quiet. And Clay? You kidding me? He hates Shapey. He may not know who's the dad, or maybe he's in denial about it, but he knows for a fact that Shapey isn't his. So, he doesn't care. Not one bit. This causes Shapey to experience tons of neglect. Neither parent really cares about him, so he's constantly throwing himself into harm's way. Not on purpose, it's just because he's an unruly, undisciplined kid. Then halfway through the show, a new family moves in next door to the Puppingtons, and they are basically the exact same as them, only slightly altered. They even have an unruly, undisciplined, illegitimate child named Block. And he's basically the same thing as Shapey, although the two look absolutely nothing alike. At the end of the episode, the new family moves away. However, they end up taking Shapey and leaving Block with the Puppingtons, and neither family really realizes. Only Orel and the Possible's daughter, Christina, actually recognize it, but they can never seem to tell their parents. And Block kinda has the same development as Shapey. He's loud, he's undisciplined, he's extremely rude, but nobody does anything to stop him. And of course, everyone except for those two I mentioned think that he's Shapey and not Block. However, in the Season 3 premiere, Numb, Bloberta finally figures out that Block isn't Shapey, so she calls Mrs. Possible to get the kids switched back. However, not everything goes according to plan. Shapey's happy to see his mom again, but Block doesn't run back to the Possible house. Instead, he chooses Bloberta, causing him to get abandoned by his real family and then becomes an honorary Puppington. Yeah, Bloberta just takes in both Shapey and Block, and the two of them cause unadulterated agony in the Puppington house from there on out, for a while. Before we get to that, let's talk about why Block might have chosen Bloberta over his real mom. So I have two theories for this. One, my first idea is that maybe somehow the Puppington house was a lot better than the Possible one. Specifically, maybe Bloberta actually treated Block better instead of like neglect. He maybe was used to abuse or something, I don't know. Or the more likely one, and the one that doesn't require overthinking things, maybe he just saw Shapey hug Bloberta and thought, cool, we're doing this now, not really realizing what he was doing. Either way, now he has two brothers instead of one sister. He and Shapey get in a lot of trouble but still become the best of friends. However, that's not really gonna last too long because of a lot of things that happen in the house. Clay ends up shooting Orel in the leg during the hunting trip. Not only that, but he finds Dr. Potter's Wheel's handkerchief, putting two and two together, realizing that Bloberta had been kinda cheating on him when he was away. As a result of this, as well as finally coming to terms with the fact that Orel is probably never going to be like him and is too sensitive for his own good, Clay kinda loses it as we see in the episode Sacrifice. He finally goes off on everybody and fully commits to being the awful person he always was deep down. What does this have to do with Shapey and Block? Well, back home, they're visibly worried about what's going on. They know that something's happening and that it's bad news. Shapey even tells his mom,
when I'm thirsty, it feels how I feel when I'm alone.
That's the first time Shapey has ever spoken coherently. But keep in mind, Shapey up until this point was basically a walking hurricane, causing nothing but destruction wherever he went. So now he's finally sensing the moment and realizing that things aren't really going to be the same ever again. And judging by the look on Block's face, he realizes it too. And I'm not the only one who thinks this too, because the series creator has actually confirmed it with one of the few episodes that we found out about that we weren't necessarily supposed to. In other words, he told us about an unproduced episode that never got to be. And this one was about Shapey and Block finally growing up and maturing as young boys. We don't have much information about this episode, but it seems like this moment from Sacrifice really started everything off. All we really have is that they bond. But we also have seen them bond in the very first episode where they became brothers. Not to mention the episode where Block was first introduced. So this could only mean that they bond over something like this. Otherwise, it'd just be kinda redundant. Besides, given the fact that Shapey and Block basically only speak in one-word sentences, you can't really have an entire episode with them bonding unless they actually talk. And with Shapey talking at the end of Sacrifice, this has to be what it means, right? And even in the last episode, Honor, yeah, they kind of slap each other around a little bit, but they're not doing things like licking lighters or sticking sewing needles in their eyes. They're just horsing around like little boys do. And when Clay and Bloberta are having their fight in the hallway of the apartment complex, they start caroling. Not screaming, not fighting or anything, they're just having fun, thinking that this is what the family's supposed to do. This might seem like I'm reading too deeply into it, but look at everything that Shapey and Block have done before. When Dr. Chosenberg is stuck in the hospital, Block desperately wants a drink, and starts fighting and screaming. Similarly, when Shapey's supposed to be waiting for Orel to get back with his Christmas gift, he goes off to the nativity scene and completely destroys it. See, doing something like this is not in either of their characters unless they grew up. And it's no secret given the fact that Moral Orel was cancelled early that we missed a lot of important stuff. For example, Bloberta was eventually supposed to get with Officer Papermouth, and Florence was supposed to lose weight and finally find happiness with Reverend Putty. Not to mention the thing that I mentioned in the last Moral Orel video, Miss Censordoll was eventually supposed to take over all of Moralton, usurping Clay's authority. We got this set up at the end of Nesting, and we never saw any follow-up because the show got cancelled the very next episode. Many others who reviewed the show have noted that the storylines were either cut short, were rushed, or were seemingly completed off screen. And that seems to be what happened with Shapey and Block. But hey, at least we know for a fact they're okay now. Judging by Orel's wall when he's an adult, Shapey has now become a police officer and Block has now become a fireman. Both are occupations that require a severe amount of discipline. So yeah, they did grow up. They went from being nightmare boys to being respectable young men. I just wish we could have seen it. This is the show that made Nurse Bendy, who is basically a comic relief harlot character, extremely sympathetic. You feel for her when she's going through her issues in the episode alone. So to see them do the exact same thing with Shapey and Block, who've been nothing but background to comic relief characters at best, that would have been amazing. The signs were all there, and we have the beginning and end, just the middle was cut out. This is why I completely believe that if Moral Orel came out today, it would have been a gigantic success. And with the big underground movement that's starting to become mainstream, I don't see why Adult Swim doesn't give it another shot. I mean, come on, they're already focusing on heavy nostalgia stuff. That's what everyone's doing. Why not do Moral Orel as well? Especially with people begging and pleading for it to come back and finish what it started. And this is a guy who hates reboots talking, so you know it's severe. Either way, Shapey and Block were not only interesting characters when you look at their origins, but they also had some pretty good growth at the end of the show. It's too bad we weren't allowed to see it, though. We're going there, folks. Today's character quest is going to be all about Bloberta Puppington, and I bet a lot of you are wondering, wait a minute.
Wait a second.
Character quest is supposed to be about those characters that a lot of people don't understand or don't think are very deep. Everyone loves Bloberta and everyone loves picking her apart, so why is she here? First off, it's because, to be honest, I love making Moral Orel videos. In case you can't tell by the 2 others we made and the many more we have in the future, this is not gonna go away anytime soon. Also, nobody's really done a deep dive into Bloberta, at least that I could see, on a YouTube video, so here we go. It's time to get down and dirty, which I know she doesn't like, but still, we gotta do it. It's time to look at what makes Bloberta Puppington so broken. And the short answer is only 2 words. Clay Puppington. It's his fault she's like this. He's the reason that she's miserable, but she's not entirely innocent either. Before I discuss that, let's get into the bare basics. Bloberta is the mother of the Puppington household, and she hates every minute of it. Now, I'm sure she has some love for Orel and minimal love for Shapey. I don't even know how she feels about Block. Those two, never interact. But she's so checked out of this family and just wants to be done. Clay makes her miserable every hour of every day. He's a brute, he's a drunk, he's angry, he's stubborn, and he's neglectful, although she's not one to talk there. All she wants is an escape. Orel can't provide that, Shapey most certainly can't provide that, and Clay is the problem. So she whiles away her days cleaning everything in sight. Whether it be the floor, the walls, her own cleaning products, whatever it is, she has to clean it just so that she can stay busy. It's not that she's a neat freak or something, she just has to be useful because that's how she's raised. Bloberta grew up in a very abusive household that treated her like she was nothing. Her mother was an insane narcissist that loved her brother Lunchbox more than her and her older sister, and her father was basically not in the picture. He was there, but his presence was always seen and not heard and felt. Because she was so overlooked growing up, she had the unstoppable need to be helpful to somebody, that way she can finally be valued. For once, she can feel happy about herself, and for once, she can feel like she's not a waste of time and space. She thought Clay was going to be exactly that, but it turns out that marrying him was a big, big mistake. She's helpful to him, yeah, but does he appreciate it? No. Does he hate her and every fiber of her being? Oh yeah, and he is not shy about it, so in short, Bloberta is stuck in her own personal hell. The only thing that she can do to get away is to die or run off with another guy. She tried doing that once too, and it didn't exactly work out. That man was Coach Stopframe, who was only pretending to be interested in her so that he could impregnate her, and have a child so that he can get closer to Clay. However, that entire time, Bloberta thought that she finally found the one guy that would treat her like a real person and who would appreciate her help. Finally, she can find somewhere where she belongs and she can be happy for the very first time ever, but nope, it's all a lie. Stop Frame broke it off, leaving Shapey behind, and as we've firmly established, Shapey is not exactly the most well-behaved child. He yells, he screams, he destroys everything, and Bloberta just doesn't care. Shapey is not only a constant reminder that she could have had a much better life, but also the fact that he's every parent's worst nightmare means that she wants nothing to do with him and constantly, accidentally I might say, throws him into harm's way by having a bunch of dangerous equipment in his room, and also doesn't really care when he gets hurt or nearly ingests chemicals. There's a fan theory going around that Bloberta actually does want Shapey dead, but I don't really know how I feel about that, so I'm not really going to discuss it here. She cares about Orel enough. She loves him, yeah, but still doesn't really give him a lot of attention. The only reason she cared about Orel being bullied was because he kept getting blood all over his shirts and she had to double her detergent budget when she did laundry. Oh no! And before Orel especially, there's a lot of signs that Bloberta really does care about Orel and wants the best for him. However, because she's so checked out of the family and wants to disassociate herself entirely, Orel's kind of collateral damage here. It's not like she wants to cut him out of her life, but that just goes along with the whole I don't want to be here thing. Orel gets dragged along for the ride and he doesn't really seem to notice, so I guess everyone wins? And I bet you're wondering, why doesn't she just try to patch things up with Clay? I mean, surely they could go to some kind of marriage counseling, right? No, that's not really possible for two reasons. One, if they went to marriage counseling, what would that say about their reputation? Bloberta and Clay really care about their reputation. If Moralton finds out they're having marital problems, then what are they gonna be? The subject of gossip, that's what. That's why they didn't get divorced at the end of the Christmas episode, by the way. They had to keep that image of the perfect 1950s household intact. And Bloberta's trying extra hard. We don't really know how much effort Clay's putting in, but we can clearly see how upset Bloberta is about it. First of all, look at her reaction when Clay comes home and God's blunders. Now that doesn't seem like forced happiness, does it? And secondly, especially in the third season, she proceeds to get more and more depressed the longer she's in this marriage. It gets to the point where we have episodes like Numb, where she has the house entirely to herself, except for Shapey, and decides to mutilate herself in order to get some amount of pleasure because no one else is giving it to her. Both physically and emotionally speaking, by the way. That's why she ends up having that semi-affair with Dr. Potter's Wheel. And when she has that semi-affair, she has to cover it up in order to keep the image going, but I don't want to explain that because I'd be repeating myself. Let's get to the more important second point why she doesn't just try to make things up with Clay. His hatred for her cannot be stopped because of what she did to him. She ruined his life. And I'm not just saying this in the nice guy way of, oh, he got tied down when he didn't want to be. Ew, she's such a bad girl. Stay single, my kings. No, not like that. At Coach Fakey and Millie Spraybooth's wedding, Bloberta was having a very difficult time. All of her friends were about to get married. Meanwhile, she was single with no prospects of changing that, which, like I mentioned before, is a very big deal because she had to be useful and helpful to someone. And then she laid eyes on Clay, a single, young, dapper man who was sitting there in the church. She didn't know anything about him, but she knew she had to have him. So they started talking, and things were not really going the best. They were talking about a lot of awkward subjects, and their conversations kept stalling. And then she learned that Clay didn't drink, and she thought that was just the weirdest thing ever, so she kept pushing, and pushing, and pushing, and eventually got Clay to drink his first highball. And then another, and another, and another, and then bam, Clay became an alcoholic in one day. Yes. It's Bloberta that got Clay started on his alcoholism, but that's not enough. She heard that Clay wanted to be single for the rest of his life. Whether that's because he wanted to be celibate or because he was struggling with his bisexuality, we don't really know. But much like the drinks issue, she kept pressuring him, and eventually he broke down and decided to marry her. And even before they said I do, they were completely miserable. Clay blames her for ruining his life, and he will never, ever forgive her. Sometimes he'll even drink to try to have a better view of her, but no matter what, he always hates her and can barely even tolerate her. It never improves. And she knows it too, and you know what? I don't really feel bad for her because she should have seen this coming. Clay made a fool of himself when he was drunk at the reception. He kept drinking every drink in sight and hitting on any girl he saw. Bloberta had an out. She could have ran for the hills, but no, she didn't. She was so desperate and psychologically damaged that she felt that Clay was her only option. I mean, yeah, that's sad, but still, she ruined 2 lives just so that she could have some kind of comfy living or something, but she never really got that. Nor did she really get a happy ending either. See, Moral Orel ends without Bloberta finishing her character arc from Numb. It just kinda stops. She's eternally unfulfilled, unloved, and unhappy. The series ends with her being stuck in a loveless marriage with Clay until she dies, but that's not how it was supposed to end, no. Instead, she actually got a happy ending. Do you remember Officer Papermouth? The clumsy, dim-witted but good-hearted policeman of Moralton? Well, his wife Florence divorced him and he's been having a very difficult time. Take a look at him in Sacrifice if you don't believe me. Believe it or not, he was supposed to get together with Bloberta, and Bloberta for the very first time in her entire life felt real love and affection. It wasn't the one-sided fake stuff like with Stop Frame, it was real love. It's never been made clear if they were going to end up staying together, but this is Moral Orel. They never cheap out on a story arc unless they have to, and that only really happens when the network cuts their season short. Do I want Bloberta to get a happy ending? Yes, no, it's hard to say. But if it gets Officer Papermouth to have a happy ending, then I guess it's worth it. And who knows? Maybe if she got together with Papermouth, she'd be a better mom to Orel, Shapey, and Block. And then she could finally leave Clay behind forever and start a whole new life, maybe even outside of Moralton. But no, that never happened. Instead, she did get the bad ending, which I think is partially deserved, but I don't know. Sometimes she's really sympathetic, but sometimes she's just awful. It's not like it depends on episode to episode, it just depends on what way you look at it. She's a girl who ruined someone's life just for the sake of comfort, but she's also someone who was psychologically damaged and didn't really know any better, and now that she's wised up, she desperately wants to leave, but has no chance of doing so. So, where do you fit on this spectrum? Because I am honestly in the middle. It kind of depends on the day and what episode I watch. In episodes like Numb, oh yeah, I feel really bad for her and I wish that she could have a better situation. But in Help, not really. Still, that makes for a very interesting character, and it shows how great of a show Moral Orel was. It shows that not every character has to be black and white on the morality scale. They can be kinda gray. Some good, some evil, and that's real life too. Not everybody's wholly good and not everybody's wholly evil. But now, if you didn't already, I hope you can understand what makes Bloberta Puppington so broken. It's time for the big one. We talked about Bloberta a few days ago, so now we're gonna talk about her husband, our main character's father, and the main villain of the entire show, Clay Puppington. The worst of the worst when it comes to Moralton residents, this guy is something else. A lot of people have a lot of theories and observations about Clay, but very few people have compiled them into one whole video. So now sit back and relax while we dissect Clay Puppington. Here we go. So first off, we have to start off with Clay's quote-unquote origin story, because every villain needs an origin story. Clay was the golden child of his household, but that's not saying a lot because he was the only child. Sort of. His dad seemed like a kind, respectable man who tried to be a good dad, but his mom, not so much. She kept losing child after child due to miscarriages caused by her drinking, smoking, and going on roller coasters. Yeah, that's a good sign. Oh boy. So when she didn't do any of that stuff when she was pregnant with Clay, Clay came out as a normal functioning boy. So she saw to change all of that. Clay became very self-absorbed as a child, making everything all about him. I know that that's usually a kid thing in general, but Clay took it to the next level. Everything always had to be about him, or the pictures had to involve him in some way. Definitely not a very considerate kid. And then when he realized that he was gonna have other siblings before his mother miscarried, he played a joke, pretending to kill himself with a family gun. And this caused his mother to have a heart attack and die. Ever since then, Clay Clay's dad hated Clay and slapped him around for every little thing. He blamed Clay for the death of his wife, and to be fair, that's not necessarily unfounded, but still, he's just a kid. At some point, Clay associated these frequent beatings and slappings with his father loving him, which isn't true at all. Like I said, his dad hates him and considers him a disappointment. He even decided to break a generations-long tradition of the Puppington family hunting trip just because he hated his son. Clay didn't really pick up on that because of his narcissism. His mother trained him to not see anybody hating him under any circumstances, so somehow, obviously, this has to be his dad's way of showing affection. And we can see this with how he treats Orel when he becomes an adult. He spanks Orel for basically every little mess up he does, even for minor things like questioning his authority. And notice how he only does this to Orel? He doesn't do this to Shapey or Block, and definitely not Bloberta, showing that he hates them. He doesn't care about them at all. Like we discussed in their previous character quests, he sees Shapey as an illegitimate child and a constant reminder that his wife was unfaithful. And then Block just showed up out of nowhere and bam, second illegitimate child. Why would he want that? It's just another mouth to feed and he already is strapped for cash. And Bloberta ruined his life. He hates her with a burning passion, his number one least favorite person ever. Let's talk about that. Clay was a squeaky clean Mormon stereotype without the Mormonism, and Bloberta set eyes on him and knew that she had to make him hers. Why? Simply because he was a decent looking single man around her age and she was desperate to marry literally anybody. Clay never wanted to get married because, in his words, it wasn't something that would last. However, we now know, given what happened in the end of the show, this was also because he was struggling with his bisexuality. It's clear that a lot of the people of Moralton don't really look so kindly on that kind of stuff, so it was up to Clay to repress it all. But Bloberta struck anyways, and then kinda manipulated, kinda tricked Clay into marrying her, and immediately he knew that he was done for. His life, his plans, all gone. He was miserable before he even said, "I do." And ever since then, he's plotted not necessarily specific revenge, but just horrible, nasty thoughts against his wife. He also got hooked onto alcohol because of Bloberta and is now a barely functioning alcoholic. He drinks day in and day out to get his pain away, but it never works. In fact, it only makes things worse. He can have the occasional beer goggles that makes him see his family in a positive light, but as soon as they're gone, it doubles his pain every single time. And he takes it out on anybody he sees, especially his wife and kids. Of course, Bloberta is constantly neglected, but Orel? He not only spanks him, although in Clay's case, that's a sign of showing familial love. He also neglects Orel a lot. Whenever Orel says something like, "I love you, Dad," he'll always say something like, "Oh yeah, I'm hungry too," or "Yeah, that's good." He's got a complicated relationship with the boy that is often explored in very different ways throughout the series. He wants Orel to be a lot like him, basically mold him into a good, young Christian boy. And hey, if he also gets addicted to alcohol, whatever, that's not his fault. He did everything he could as the good, strong father. So he wants to parent Orel in that way, but he doesn't want to parent him in any other way at all. He doesn't really care about his friends or even want to meet them. He doesn't want to get involved in Orel's affairs, and he only wants to talk to Orel when Orel's screwing up in a way that affects him. And those of you who watch the show will probably wonder, how do things like raising the dead or smoking crack affect Clay at all? Well, that's because Clay values one thing above all else: his image. And that's not just because he's the mayor of Moralton, although we'll talk about that later. It's because he wants to have a good standing in the community. He wants to be that upstanding, good, righteous man. So if Orel's doing something to hurt his reputation, then he's gonna be very upset. Like in the episode Innocence, when he gets outraged because he has to take responsibility for giving Orel bad advice. This is also why he didn't divorce Bloberta in The Best Christmas Ever. He wanted to make sure that everyone in Moralton saw him as a good guy. And obviously, if he divorced his wife, that wouldn't be good at all, even if it was for something like infidelity, because if word got out that Bloberta cheated on him, how would that make him look? It would make him look weak, that's what, and he can't stand that at all. So that leads me to another part about Clay. It's his strange relationship with his family. I know I've kind of discussed how he's very distant, but there's also another aspect that was explored in Sacrifice. It's that he wants them all together as a unit, not because he wants it, but so that other people can't have it. This is most specifically relating to Bloberta. Now that he's married her, he doesn't want anyone else having her or else he's gonna be seen as a failure. He only keeps her around just so that he can keep her away from other people. And this explains why he hates Shapey so much, because he's a constant reminder that he failed in his mission. Bloberta did go out and seek somebody else. She slept with them and had a kid, pretending all these years that he was Clay's, even though this whole time, Clay had a funny feeling. I mean, for one, he doesn't even remember conceiving Shapey, and two, Shapey doesn't look anything like him. But who does Shapey look like? Oh, that's who. Danielle's stop frame, Clay's best friend and pseudo-lover. Clay, like I said, is a bisexual man, and he struggles with that, trying to repress it, but also having these unbeatable feelings that he has to get out, especially because his home life is so terrible that, essentially, Danielle here, who he's desperately in love with, is his escape, and Stop Frame knows this full well. He's been trying to destroy Clay and Bloberta's marriage for at least 7 years, because he's the one that sought Bloberta out and then wanted to have a kid with her just so that he could get close to Clay. Throughout the show, it was constantly teased that Clay maybe knows what Stop Frame did and maybe knows how he feels, but he can't really act on that despite feeling the same way. They were mostly used as jokes throughout the show. But then the infamous 3rd season rolled around and we started exploring this as a legitimate character trait for not only Clay, but Stop Frame as well. Maybe we'll give Stop Frame his own character quest, who's to say? But right now we're talking about Clay. Hey, that rhymes. We see Clay struggling more and more with who he is right now and who he wants to be. Of course, we don't feel anything for him because he's a terrible, awful, irredeemable person, and he gets exactly what he deserves. What is it? Well, we'll discuss that towards the end, because right now, we have to talk about Clay's development throughout the series. In the first season, Moral Orel was strictly a comedy with some minor character elements here and there. He basically served to be Orel's disciplinarian dad who gave him some really strange life advice. And then as the 2nd season rolled around, we got to see just how much of a tightwad, an angry man, and abusive husband he is. And then nature happens, where he takes Orel on the father-son hunting trip, the same one that he never got to go on with his dad because he decided to pick the tradition right back up. Here, he finally opens up to Orel about just how miserable he is, only for him to shoot Orel in the leg and not care at all. Partially because he's drunk and also partially because, it's not his problem. He's not the one who got shot. This causes Orel to see Clay as the man he truly is for the very first time in his entire life. And from then on, their relationship would never be the same ever again. And of course, a lot of season 3 takes place before the hunting trip, and even then, we get to see a lot of the darker sides of Clay. Like how when he was preparing Orel for the hunting trip, he decided to favor Dowie instead of him, and then later told Dowie to his face that the whole thing was just a ploy to get Orel to be a better shot. Or when Orel has a vision about heaven, he literally beats it out of him. In the penultimate episode, Nesting, he and Orel have their very first fight. It becomes clear to Clay that he can no longer scare Orel into doing what he wants. That and his spankings no longer have any effect on him. In fact, Orel just doesn't care about them at all. Gone are the days where he had any respect for his son and where he could mold him into a little version of himself. He's now entirely powerless, without an ally in this war zone of a house. And what does he do? He tells Orel that he's glad he shot him. Yeah, that's what he says to his own son. As if things couldn't get worse, huh? At least he's got Danielle, right? Not necessarily, because he screws that up as well. Miss Censordoll was running against Clay to become mayor of Moralton because, let's face it, Clay isn't the best leader. He's corrupt, he's lazy, and he's only doing the job for the money. However, Censordoll realizes that Clay has an Oedipus complex and decides to exploit it. Clay ends up going along with it too, and in public no less. He's not really attracted to her, like, at all. He just wants to do this so that she can stop bothering him when he's doing his mayoral duties. Danielle sees this, and then a light bulb goes off in his head. Just like Orel, he sees just how bad of a person Clay is. In fact, he and Orel end up bonding over it and become good friends. Clay sees this and becomes extremely jealous. And when he goes over to Danielle's apartment to confront him, he accidentally confesses his love, but then decides to double down and say yes, this is how he feels, and he's ready to leave Bloberta for him. Only problem is, it's too late. Danielle's no longer interested and doesn't want anything to do with him ever again, so he has to leave and then never talk to the one he loves ever again. And this is where Clay's arc ends. He no longer has the respect of any of his kids, the one he loves, the community, and also he's stuck in a marriage that he can't stand. He and Bloberta are doomed to spend eternity together because they don't want to risk ruining their image, at least more so than it already has been, and he certainly doesn't have any other prospects, so what's he gonna do? Be alone forever? That's not a good look. Although this wasn't really gonna be the end for Clay. Had the show gone on, he was gonna be forever alone. Not alone with Bloberta, just alone in general. Bloberta was eventually gonna fall in love with Officer Papermouth, and they were gonna find a legitimately happy relationship. And it's also assumed that she would have ran off with him and started a new family. So as soon as he gets rejected by Coach Stopframe, that's it. Just like what he wanted in Help, he's gonna be alone by himself with the Bible, only this time, he's come so far since then that that's no longer what he wants. But there's nothing he can do about that now because, as Coach Stopframe said, it's too late. So either way, Clay was doomed to have an unhappy ending, whether Moral Orel was cancelled or ended naturally, so yeah. He does get his just desserts in the end. Honestly, I gotta say, Clay is my favorite character in the entire show. Not because he's a good person, I think we can all agree he's like the worst in the show, but it's because he's so fascinating. Literally everything he does is evil. He hasn't done one nice thing in the entire run of the show. I tried to find some, trust me, I looked all over and I couldn't find any. He's such an irredeemable monster, but he's so fascinating to just dissect and look at all the layers surrounding him because, as Clay says, he poisons everyone else around him, so obviously, he's the center of all the Moral Orel development. Take a look at all the characters we talked about before. Shapey, Block, Bloberta, Miss Censordoll, even Orel. All of their development comes from him. If Clay wasn't the way he was, this show wouldn't be nearly as good, but because he is, and because he's just that terrible, Moral Orel is one of the greatest Adult Swim shows that ever was. He makes the show worth watching, and I think more people need to give him the credit that he deserves. I can't believe we've been talking about Moral Orel for 14 months, and we've never once made a character quest on Orel himself. Well, time to fix that, right? Orel Puppington is one of the best written characters in the entire show, but I don't really think that should surprise you because he's the main character. Of course he's going to be well written. He's the one who has the most development and growth. And boy, does he ever grow. Orel has always been a kind-hearted, good-natured young man. He always wants to do what's right in the eyes of God, as well as making people around him feel happy. He doesn't have a mean bone in his body. At least, not an intentionally mean one, because Orel tends to do some pretty nasty things. Like, I don't know, beating up his friends and family because he wants to teach them about turning the other cheek, raising the dead and sending an army of zombies to harass Moralton with their nakedness, and getting his friends to slit their wrists so he can bathe in their blood.
Dude, this is pretty f***ed up right here.
But even though he does these pretty bad things, he still tries to do what's right. The show's called Moral Orel for a reason, because in his eyes, he thinks he's doing the right thing. That is until Clay brings him to a study and spanks some sense into him, but still, Orel never intends to do something wrong. Speaking of Clay, it's a wonder how Orel became as good-natured of a person as he is. He grew up in a dark and miserable household run by two negligent parents, with Bloberta being cold and distant and Clay being, well, a monster. Orel could have been on the fast track towards failure. But no, as we've seen in Before Orel, his naivete and willingness to do the right thing has always been around. And this is right around the time when he discovered God. Thanks to Clay being pressured by Miss Censordoll, Orel ended up getting a somewhat comprehensive Bible lesson from Clay, and he immediately fell in love with the Christian religion. But given Orel's natural obliviousness, he started to misinterpret the Bible very quickly. In fact, within a few short days, he was willing to sacrifice his little brother Shapey, just like Abraham did with Isaac. Luckily, he got stopped at the last minute, but this solidified his faith 100%. To Orel, Shapey getting rescued from being slaughtered was proof that God is real. So Orel became a devoted follower from that day on. And like I mentioned earlier, he never grew out of misinterpreting things and going way too far. In fact, that's kind of what the town expects from him going forward. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but it gets to the point in Season 3 where everyone basically blames Orel for all the town's problems, even if he's not actually the cause of them. The musical episode! With Orel basically being the town menace, it's up to Clay, his loving and devoted father, to set him straight. And he does, in very strange ways. The only thing that Clay really seems to take pride in when it comes to his son is the fact that he can impart his wisdom onto the next generation. And of course, Orel eats them all up, taking them to heart without questioning them whatsoever. And that's really dangerous because what Clay teaches is far from the truth. Like a lot of the people of Moralton, the way that Clay views the world is warped and twisted, and he's trying to impart that onto Orel. Orel, being the trusting kid that he is naturally going to accept this because it comes from his father. His father's the best person in the world. He would never betray him or lie to him. Why does he have any reason to question what Clay says? Clay is the moral guardian of Orel's life, basically the arbiter of what's right and what's wrong. Throughout the first 2 seasons, Orel lives a relatively happy life. Even if he messes up, that's all part of growing up, right? You gotta learn some lessons, gotta put some hair on your chest. Though from an outsider looking in, you'd kinda have to question why Orel's so happy. Simply put, the reason he sees the world is different from most other people. He sees Clay as a devoted father figure who's always there to help him. He sees Bloberta as a kind and loving mother who's actually attentive. And he sees Shapey and or Block as the mischievous little brother who's always trying to get away with something. This meshes perfectly with the kind of image that Moral Orel Season 1 is trying to set up. A generally functional, overall sustainable quality of life. And even if there are some cracks here and there, those are probably normal. There's no reason to draw attention to those. And boy, do those cracks ever show up. At the end of the best Christmas ever, Orel learns that Clay and Bloberta are planning to get divorced. So what does Orel do? Does he break down and cry? Does he go through a depressive spiral? No, he just smiles, looks up to the heavens, and prays. All he can do is think positive and believe that the problem's gonna work itself out over time. Not even the Shapey and Block switch could bum him out. In fact, he seems to roll with it quite well. He may never see his brother again, and he has this totally new but also kind of the same brother. And the worst reaction he has to that is trying to tell people, hey, that's not Shapey. But then when they don't react or when they cut him off, he moves on. That's it. Throughout seasons 1 and 2, I'm sure if you asked Orel, if he was real, he'd probably say that the worst thing he ever went through was getting grounded from church. Yes, I know that's a season 3 episode, but it happens during the events of season 2, so yeah. But that's when nature comes into play. Everything changes here once and for all. Clay decides to reignite the family tradition of taking the eldest son out for the Puppington family hunting trip, and Orel comes back a changed kid. He does not see his family the same way that he used to. For the very first time, he's forced to look at Clay dead on. No rose-colored glasses, no manipulation, nothing is clouding his vision. He sees Clay for what he truly is. A damaged man, yes, but one who's decided to use his damage as a weapon. Instead of getting better, he just decides to wallow in his misery and take out said misery on everybody else. The trip didn't even start well with Clay throwing out everything that Orel packed except his lucky shirt, but Orel seemed to kind of take it in stride. That is until Clay gets drunk, and he has that infamous and really compelling monologue that scares Orel to his core. He's never seen Clay like this before. He had no idea that his father was feeling all these things. And then, Orel gets shot. By his own dad. I'm sure that if Clay swooped in and tried to heal Orel or take him to the hospital all while screaming, "What have I done?" I'm sure Orel would have forgiven him in time. But no, Clay doesn't do that. He drinks the rubbing alcohol that Orel was going to use to clean his wound, rips Orel's lucky shirt to tie around the wound, and then goes right to sleep. Yeah, so what if his kid's bleeding out? Who cares if he's in excruciating pain? He's got to get his sleep. And Orel says the 3 words that I don't think he said to anybody before in his entire life.
I hate you.
This marks the end of their father-son bond. After this point, Orel becomes completely ambivalent to whatever his dad says. Whether he praises him, bribes him, threatens him, he gets no reaction. Orel is done with Clay, absolutely done. The two of them keep growing further apart, with Orel supporting Miss Censordoll's bid for becoming Mayor of Moralton instead of Clay, Orel hanging out with Stopframe all the time, and even badmouthing Clay behind his back, saying that there's nothing honorable about him. Orel still has his kindly demeanor and all, and he's still a chipper, happy kid, but his home life isn't the same. He even says as much in the episode Sacrifice. Now we're gonna have to pause here because from here on, this is where things get a little, fuzzy, I guess you could say. The rest of Orel's arc never made it to screen. Yes, the show got canceled before the main character could finish his character arc.
Isn't that just swell?
In the later seasons, and by this I mean 4 and 5, Arthur Puppington, Clay's father and Orel's grandfather, would have become a major character. It would be revealed that Arthur was diagnosed with a terminal illness and he would decide to spend the rest of his days in the Puppington household. Here, he becomes the first real parental figure that Orel has ever had. From the descriptions of the episode that we got later on, it seems to be implied that Arthur would have helped Orel become a lot more streetwise. He wouldn't trust everything and anything just because he can and probably should, even though he really shouldn't. He would finally be able to judge for himself whether a person was good or not. One of the episodes in particular really catches my attention. It's one where Arthur teaches Orel how everyone in Moralton, despite claiming that they're the best people ever, are actually quite horrible. Even Reverend Putty, like we talked about a few months ago, even he's not a great person when you get down to it. Him being morally gray and kind of center-ish makes him one of the better people in the town by default and default only. This could be a real eye-opener for Orel. Here he was, growing up his entire life believing that he should be just like people like Clay, or Coach Stopframe, or Principal Fakey. But they're the exact opposite kind of people that a young Christian should strive to be like. Then, Arthur dies, and Orel goes through a massive depression, to the point where he goes goth for a while, but I guess it's just a phase because he's not like this in any other episode. Sort of like with Shapey and Block in the episodes Honor and Abstinence, we can see Orel's behavior change in the final episode, as if all this development happened and we all knew what it was. The Orel we see in Honor is not the same one we got in the likes of, say, God's Chef or The Best Christmas Ever. He's a bit more aware of the world and knows how to judge people, but he's still that chipper, upbeat kid he's always been. And probably always will be. And yes, I do mean kid because I'm sure we can all agree that when Orel grows up, he's basically gonna be a big kid at heart. Oh right, I guess I should talk about Orel growing up before this video's over, huh? Yes, despite living with Clay and Bloberta his entire life, despite all the terrible things that have happened to him and the terrible things he's done, Orel grows up to have a loving, happy family. One with the girl that he's always loved, and he gets to have a dog and keep it this time. It sure was a lot of struggling, but Orel got the good ending. He, Shapey, and Block seem to be the only ones that really did. And you know, I think he deserves it. Does he always do the right thing? Absolutely not. But is he a good person? Yeah, of course. At least when you don't look at his actions. Despite the fact that he's basically living in a totalitarian hell on earth, Orel remains a good-hearted, kind person who's always out there to help a friend in the most unorthodox ways possible. Which I think is why we keep coming back again and again.